Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the service, Trish, and the worship group. I got so lost in it, I forgot I was preaching at one point. Then I suddenly remembered. So, okay. I don't watch soap operas. I just read Genesis. Because it's brilliant, isn't it? If you took... I might have said this last time because I think I preached on Genesis, but if you took the plots and made them into film scripts, they'd just be soap operas, wouldn't they? It's brilliant. It's a bit like, I quite like Tudor history as well, and it's a little bit the same, as in they're all corrupt. It's hard to find a good one amongst them, isn't it? Because Jacob... we know that he's born clutching the heel of his brothers and sort of, fighting to be first. And his name means, he clutches the heel, it means deceiver. And then there's Laban. He's a bit of a... I don't know, would he be a bit of a Del boy? He's not an honest guy, is he? When I was looking at some of the commentaries that have got things about these verses, one of them points out that although he agrees with Jacob and says, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man, he doesn't actually name which daughter. Even though Jacob asked for Rachel, Laban doesn't actually say that it's and there was a query in the commentary whether Laban had planned all along that he was going to pull this switch. You see, in their culture, the groom had to pay a bride price. And Jacob works for 7 years, doesn't he? That's his bride price. And apparently that was exorbitant. That was a huge bride price. The bride price was a strange thing, because although there was a bride price, Laban had to give a dowry. So would have took with one hand and given with the other. And it is fair comment that he did give an extravagant dowry, because to give a servant apparently was a huge dowry. But it might well have been that Laban was still doing his plotting and his planning, because the dowry stayed with the woman. So if something happened and Jacob divorced her or he died, that would have provided for his daughter. So maybe he's still plotting and planning. But certainly what he gets off Jacob is a huge bride price. So there's two of our characters. And then we have Rachel and Leah. And I can't see how they pull this off without both being complicit. I can't imagine Rachel weeping in the corner or being locked in. There has to have been some... she has to have been involved in the switch, doesn't she? They've both been complicit. And although Jacob wakes up and goes, oh, there's Leah, Leah didn't wake up and go, oh, here's Jacob. So, they're both complicit. So that's why I say they're all corrupt. There's not an honest... I wouldn't want to call them victims, but there's not an honest, openly honest character amongst them. They're all as bad as one another. Because Jacob he's already done this, hasn't he, to his brother Esau. He's already stolen Esau's birthright. He's pulled a switch. He's done a very similar maneuver already. So, there they are. There's the list of characters. Just amongst them, it would be a case of who is the worst or who is the cleverest deceiver. And as part of Laban's deception, they have this extravagant ceremony that lasts a whole week this time, and often they only lasted one day. And Jacob actually has no close family there, does he, to watch out for him? There's no one to back him up, as there would have usually have been. So Laban is able to pull this switch on him, and the bride would have been veiled throughout the ceremony. That would have been the culture. And at the end of all the celebrations, so what would often have been at the end of a day, but in this case is at the end of a week, the groom would have wrapped her, as she was veiled, in his cloak. And I thought, oh, that's quite a nice picture. I quite like that one. Except I've always wondered how drunk was Jacob by the end of that week? And by the time he got to that bit, how drunk was he? Because if you've got, I've got a daughter and a daughter-in-law who live quite close to me. And I reckon if they were both veiled head to toe, I could still tell them which one was which. And I've always had this thought that how drunk was he? And I was really pleased to find out in one of the commentaries that they also thought the same thing. And this guy said that that the extravagant ceremony would have increased how much alcohol was there. And he also said Jacob would have been pretty drunk. So I thought, oh yes, I was right on that one. Like that. But when we look at Leah and Rachel, we have Leah, who is unmarried but is the oldest. And I can't accurately find out how old they were. Found one or two things, but I wasn't sure they were accurate. But Leah's unmarried. And we know that in that culture, that's not a good thing. Laban says that there's a culture where the eldest have to be married first. And we don't know how wide that spread that was, because I couldn't find another mention of it. But it's what he says. So we have Leah, who hasn't attracted anyone, who hasn't been married yet. And we know she's older. And we also know, because it says in our passage, that she's got weak eyes. But what we don't know anymore is exactly what that weak eyes means. And I looked it up in various places, and we've lost it. We've lost the meaning anymore. It's sometimes translated soft eyes. And one thought is that because the girls were veiled, the men liked them to have lively eyes, because it was probably the only bit they saw. And that maybe Leah didn't have very lively eyes. They were a bit dull, a bit weak or soft. And Rachel, we're told, is lovely in form and has a lovely figure and is beautiful. But Leah isn't mentioned. It's as if, in comparison, Leah just lacks, doesn't she? She's just outshone by Rachel with the eyes and the beauty and the form. And I wonder because if you carry on reading the story, the relationship between the girls is wonderful in the fact that, it continues the soap opera, the fighting between them and the things that they do. So I'm being cynical when I say wonderful. But I wonder whether Rachel's own marriage was being impeded by Leah's lack of marriage. If Dad was insistent, he marry off Leah first. But poor Leah, she's got the eye problem. She's not beautiful. She's not got the lovely figure. And there's Rachel, who's got it all, who's outshining her. And it sounds in every way. And Leah only gets a husband through deceit. And Jacob has worked 7 years for Rachel, but he gets Leah. And okay, we're in the agreement he's going to get Rachel as well. But Jacob says the first 7 years, when he thought it was Rachel he was going to get, they flew by. But he doesn't say that about the next 7 years. No comment at all. And so, perhaps he held those things against Leah. But certainly we know that Rachel was his favourite, because in the passage it says that Jacob loved Rachel. Leah, he got foisted on him, didn't he? So there we have Leah. She has no worth. She's not worth anything to anyone. Rachel knows she's the favourite, and Rachel knows she's beautiful. But equally so, Leah knows that her eyes have this problem, that no one's married her, that her husband doesn't love her. He only married her because he was tricked. He doesn't want her. I wonder about how much worth she had to her dad as well, because he had 7 years, the 7 years that Jacob was working to earn Rachel. He had that 7 years to find Leah a husband, and he didn't. We don't know. We don't have the knowledge to know whether it's because there weren't many men in the area, or the culture, that he wanted to wait, and we don't know. But he didn't find her husband. So did he wait 7 years planning because he'd got a deceitful plan to get this problem child off his hands? But she doesn't come across as she's got much worth to her dad either. Most of us would say our children have worth because they're our children. Don't you always sort of think, if you've got children, that yours is the best drawing on the wall when they're little? Or it might not be very recognisable, but it's worth something because they did it. Don't you always think that your children are really precious, really special? We don't see that. We see just that he used her in his plot. And that's the sum of this woman's life. And then on top of that, initially, she doesn't have any children. And in those days, that was really bad, because it was always the woman who was barren. If you look through at different people, characters in the Old Testament, and you find the ones that didn't have children, it will nearly always say the woman was barren. It was her fault. It was down to her. Nothing to do with Jacob. And then in verse 31, and if I asked you what you considered the most beautiful words in the Bible were, and we made a list, there would be all sorts of verses that came out, and they would all be right, because it would be what you think and what touches your heart. But for me, these are some of the most beautiful words in the Bible. And I go back to them and ponder them often, because it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive. So that first bit, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved. God saw a woman surrounded by family. You know, got the sister, got the brother, got the husband. But he saw she wasn't loved. And he did something about it. Because in that moment, in that half a verse, Leah's not, and I hesitated and I thought, do you know, to her dad and to her sister and her husband, do you even use the word ugly? Was she ugly to them with these eyes and this lack of vigour? But in that moment, she wasn't ugly. She wasn't an innocent. She was part of the deceit, and yet God saw she wasn't loved and was moved to do something about it. And that really that's why I think those are some of the most beautiful words in the Bible. That really touches me, that God sees someone not loved. And certainly with very little self-worth. So, God causes a miracle. We don't know why she wasn't. We don't know. Both sisters are childless until God intervenes, and we don't know why. But Leah becomes pregnant, and she has a son. And she names him Reuben, which means he has seen my misery. Oh, there's two things here, isn't there? So not only was she not loved, she was living in misery because she names it with the birth of the child. So he has seen my misery. And he'd seen she was unloved, and he'd moved on her behalf. But the bit that Leah doesn't get is that Almighty God, who created heaven and earth, saw you were unloved and did something. She doesn't quite get that, because what she actually says is, surely my husband will love me now. And she turns it, doesn't she, back to wanting Jacob's love. She is so desperate to get Jacob's love, her husband's love. She has missed the fact that a God who a God that is so powerful and so great that he's created the whole world. He's done this. He's seen little old you. She missed it. And then she has another one, Simeon. And Simeon means one who hears. And she gets it. She gets half of it. She says, because the Lord heard I am not loved, he gave me this one too. And then I get a little bit hopeful and think, oh, she's starting to get it. She's starting to understand that actually what it's about is what God thinks of her and what God says about her, not what these people who have got issues and baggage of their own are saying about her. But no, she's not actually there, because when Levi comes along, and his name means attached, sadly, she slips back, because she says, now my husband will become attached to me. And if you read the names of her, if you look at the meanings of her first children, they are telling her story. So now my husband will become attached to me. Well, no, this is about that God's seen your worth, isn't it? He's got his own problems, and she's missing the point. And then she has Judah, which means praise. And again, I have that little glimmer of hope. Is she going to get it? But if we read beyond this story and find out some of the things that she does, especially the bit with the mandrakes, we discover she hasn't. She hasn't realised. She's missed the point. God has loved her so much just because of who she is and because of what other people's lack of understanding of loving her and of the word, that he's given her 4 miracles. And at the end of them, what she hopes is that Jacob will change and that he will turn around and love her. But she's never going to find her worth in him. And here's God declaring it really loudly, but she misses it. Because our worth isn't about what we do. It doesn't matter what we do. If God has given you talents and gifts, you're meant to use them. But Robin preached about that a bit ago, didn't he? And he talked about reward. And so if you're called to do something and we're meant to serve, we're not in this kingdom to just sit back and do nothing. So there is a different sermon, and there is a thing about what we do. We're called to serve. But before all of that, we have this worth that is just about being made in God's image. The Bible is full of beautiful verses, isn't it? Where God says, before I knew you, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Why? Because you were worth so much to him. Before you were even born, he was watching you and aware of you. And there's the ones in Matthew where they're talking about the sparrows, where sparrows are 2 a penny, and yet God knows when one drops to the floor. And in that verse, he says, even the hairs on your head are counted and numbered. And I knew there would be someone who would be thinking that for some of us that's harder than others. I know that. But have you actually thought about the fact that number for every single one of us changes every day? Because when you brush your hair, no matter who you are, or when you get up off your pillow, there'll be 1 or 2. And yet God knows that number every day. Why? Because that's how much you're worth before you even do anything for him. Before you serve, before you use it, perhaps even before you know what those gifts are. And in the Garden of Eden, before the fall, we have that verse that says that God used to come down in the cool of the... God came down in the cool of the evening to walk with Adam and Eve. And I always think that's really... that's so lovely, isn't it? I can picture that in my imagination, God just coming out. But they hadn't... maybe they'd started tending the garden a bit, but they hadn't yet sort of done that much, had they, other than tend the garden. So what's that? And that's about their worth, isn't it? That they were worth God coming to walk with them, that God himself wanted to come walk with them and be with them. And if the fall hadn't have happened, he would be doing that with you and with me. We'd still be in that place, and he'd still be wanting to come and have time with us. But what happens is that as we grow up, other people's opinions and other people's baggage, because, my professional head really gets engaged in these stories, and I think, well, I wonder where Laban was coming from. Maybe he had no self-worth, so he passed it on to his daughter. So other people's baggage and other people's own issues, whether that's jealousy, which could be what's happening with the girls, because we know that Rachel knows how beautiful she is. Whether that's control, people who want to keep you in their box for you. Sometimes people's own sense of self-worth is low, that they put other people down to make them feel better. Sometimes when people feel threatened by someone stepping out or doing something, they actually will show anger. Some people just keep it really hidden inside, and it's a deep sadness. Some people don't do anything, they just find a corner, don't they, because they don't have the worth to come out of it. But often it's other people's things that are put on us. And we pick up this sense of worth, but we pick it up from other people. I know a story of a colleague who said that she was a teacher, and she said that she was marking a young girl's work, and she gave her a C. She gave her, and we were talking about young people with additional learning needs, and she'd given her a D. And she said to her, "You don't need to work much harder to make this a C, You just need to have this and this in." And the young girl said, "I can't get a C." And the teacher and my colleague said, "Why?" And she said, "I come from Ollerton, miss." And her lack of worth and her feelings of herself were centred on where she lived. That someone from Ollerton couldn't get a C. But we can come from Southwell, that's a totally different place, and still have picked up feelings of lack of self-worth and that we're rubbish. And the world pushes us, doesn't it, to... When I say the world, often you can have parents that want you to conform to their world, their expectations, their levels for you. And work can be like that. That this is where you're not meant to rise above that. Who are you to rise above that? And then the Bible tells us there's the devil, who's a roaring lion, who wasn't interested in you before you became a Christian, but now he'd really like to shut you up and get you in the corner. And we weren't made to carry those things, which I think is the Garden of Eden shows us that things like shame and a lack of self-worth and a lot of inner healing things, it wasn't how it was meant to be. And so we carry them now. And they stop you and they hurt inside. And the thing is, Jesus didn't come just to heal the physical. He came to heal the brokenhearted. He came to bind up the inner wounds. Yesterday I was really encouraged because at the ladies' breakfast, guess what my postcard said? And it was picked up quite randomly, but I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And whatever anyone else has said about you, or whatever else you have picked up from somewhere, God says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I need to stop. But do you know that that is just, as I've already said, sorry, but this is just as much a thing for healing, as if you came in with your arm in a sling or limping. And so if you've been carrying something like that, you know that you've picked that up from somewhere, and maybe you don't even know where, but that any of those feelings that you're not good enough, you're not worth as much, it's time to put it down. And if you want to be prayed for, and if you're brave enough, then because it does take courage if you've lived with that a long time, then Robin would love to pray with you and help you put it down. And if you want to grab us today, you can. And if that's too soon, then have a word and we'll sort out a time when we can get together. But don't carry it any longer, because you don't need to, because you were never meant to. And sadly, Leah never learns. If you read her story all the way through, she never gets it. She's always in the shadow. And yet the song that Trish brought us this morning that was beautiful says the only shadow that we want to be in is the holy overshadowing, isn't it? Where your true worth is. I have to stop. Let's pray.